I'm here.
Oh, okay, great. Okay, so Jason is here. Very cool. So I guess now we can get started. So um, it's my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker for today's thesis defense, Jonathan Stroud. Jonathan is a PhD candidate at the CSE of University of Michigan. He has done very well in his PhD study. Um, so I still remember that when we were doing PhD admissions and recruiting, we fought very hard with the other top schools in the nation to get Jonathan. We were very lucky to get him. And um, so Jonathan has been working on computer vision and more specifically video understanding. Understanding videos is a core problem in computer vision, and it is one of the most challenging topics you could work on if you study computer vision, because video is just a lot more difficult to deal with. So something you can easily do with static images, it takes 10 times, it can easily take 10x effort to run the very basic experiments. So you have to be very clever and creative in making sure that everything fits in your computer memory and your experiments don't take forever, and you can get results in time. So it's a lot of challenges, and so Jonathan has definitely risen up to the challenge and has produced a series of very impressive work that has advanced the state of the art of video understanding. So it's very exciting today for us to hear about it. Without further ado, Jonathan, please take it away.
Great. Thank you, Ja, for the introduction, and thank you everyone for being here today. So I'm excited to present my work about video action recognition. And before we begin, I just want to mention that I'm going to be doing this talk a little differently than some remote thesis defenses you may have seen before. The talk's all been recorded in advance, and so starting with the next slide, I'm going to be playing back the recording and clicking the slides along with her. I'm going to restart the talk from the beginning. Sorry for the delay. In this work, we aim to recognize human actions. We take the word action to mean any process or procedure that a person can do. So for example, cooking a meal, directing traffic, or playing basketball. Actions like this are everywhere. They're how we interact with the world and they're how we achieve our goals. And so it's no surprise that people are acting pretty much all the time. Actions are an integral part of our lives, and our goal is to build an intelligent system that's able to understand that aspect of our lives. So to see why this is important, let's imagine a robot that doesn't understand actions. That robot might see the world a little bit like this. It knows what things exist in our environment, and perhaps it knows where those things are relative to itself, but it doesn't know what those things are doing or how they're interacting with one another. So it might see a person and a cup and a robot and a bike in front of it, but it doesn't understand whether that person and robot are having a conversation. It doesn't understand if that robot is helping that person with some task, or maybe they're just sitting at the table having a friendly dinner together. But if we add some information about actions, suddenly the scene gets a lot clearer. We know the person's smiling, they're talking to the robot who's standing next to them, the person's holding a cup, maybe having a drink of water. So when we finally see the full scene, we see that we haven't really missed much, right? Just the objects and the actions together were enough to give us the gist of what was going on in the world around us. So actions and objects together are a very powerful way of representing the world, but objects alone aren't enough. So that's one good reason to study actions. Another good reason is that actions are actually a very important part of human cognition, right? They're actually how humans learn cause and effect, right? Actions are the way that we have some interaction with the world around us, and without having that interaction, we wouldn't be able to get any information about the causal structures that exist in the world. So actually actions are really important, not just to be able to recognize, but also to be able to perform if you want to learn important things about the world. Actions are also really important because they're how we communicate our goals and our intent to other people and other agents in our environment, right? So a baby crying or a person holding out their hand on the side of the road, we know that these actions mean that this person needs something, right? And so if we want to build an intelligent system that has any meaningful interaction with people, it's very important that we're able to understand all of these different aspects, right? We need to understand the stories of the world around us. We need to be able to learn cause and effect relationships. We need to recognize the goals and the intents of people around us. And so this is a really broad task, but I'd say the first step towards accomplishing it is simply to identify the actions that appear in our environment. So this brings us to the task of action recognition. This is the main task that we'll be focusing on throughout this talk. So in this task, you're given some observations about the world, and you want to determine what action is taking place at that time. So we can also expand this. We can also ask when a particular action took place or who performed it. This is a very kind of broad way of thinking about the task of action recognition. But ultimately what we end up with is some sort of information about the world, like this image here, and we want to produce something like the fact that these two men are playing racquetball. And so we can modify the task in terms of exactly what type of question we're trying to answer, but we can also modify the task in terms of what kind of observations we get about the world, right? So we can get visual information, but we can also get audio or motion information. For example, your phone sitting in your pocket has sensors that can detect whether you're walking or running. All of these different types of observations have been used for action recognition in the literature. But today we're just going to focus on video. And the reason we focus on video is because it's the primary way that humans observe actions in their environment, right? Our eyes are one of our richest sensory organs, right? It's probably the best way we can gather information about what's going on around us. And importantly, our eyes are always seeing video. They're not seeing images. It's not sufficient for us to just do action recognition from still images. We actually need video in order to understand the full story. And the reason is just that motion and context are very important, right? We can't understand what's going on around us if we don't understand how things are moving, and we also don't understand the longer term context in which those things appear. So just as a simple example, if you look at this video on the right, just from the frame that appears here, can you tell if this person's opening or closing a door? My guess is that you can't. I'd say it's pretty ambiguous just from looking at that single frame. But if we watch the clip, you see that it's actually pretty clear what's going on, just from a couple seconds of context. So another good reason to use video is that video is cheap and it's everywhere. Right? We've all got cameras in our pockets that can take really high quality video. And so this fact has led to a huge explosion in video data that's floating out there in the internet that needs to be understood and interpreted. So this leads to a lot of immediate practical applications for video action recognition. For example, video search. If we wanted to index and search through all of the data on YouTube or all of the data even just in your own photo library, we need to be able to understand what you're doing in those images in order to help you search through that. Another great application for video action recognition is autonomous driving, right? If we want to have an autonomous car that works well in a dense urban environment, it needs to understand what the pedestrians in its environment are doing, so that way it can detect things like whether a pedestrian is waiting to cross the street or whether they're. Right, so we have a question from Jason. Please feel free to unmute yourself and go ahead.
Great, Jonathan. So just a question about like the last slide or so, like, you're making the argument that video is required to do real action understanding or video understanding because you need context or the flow of information, right? How sort of deep do you think that really goes, right? Like, There's good evidence on major action recognition challenges that a method like TSN, and we may have talked about this in the past, I don't remember, which just basically randomly samples 3 frames from a video and does recognition classification on those frames and votes on them, performs as well as anything that actually looks at the video. And then even in like the case you gave, you know, a few seconds of video is one thing, but probably if you had a few frames of the video over those few seconds, you could stitch them together in a spatiotemporal manner to understand what's actually happening. So do you really think video is necessary, or spatiotemporal analysis in some way that may need a redefinition of video?
Yeah, so this is a great point. I think the reason that in a lot of these challenges and a lot of the models that we've seen don't really take advantage of motion is because most of the data sets that we have today don't really reward models for understanding motion. So fortunately, this is starting to change. There are some more recent data sets on gesture recognition, for example, where short-term instantaneous motion is kind of making a comeback as a way of representing and understanding actions. But the other point is long-term temporal context. And I think something like temporal segment networks actually do a pretty decent job of understanding long-term context by incorporating, frames from different parts throughout the video. So, which is something that a lot of models that focus on instantaneous motion don't really do super well. So I think that explains kind of why those work. So I think if we want to have more emphasis on motion, I think we need to kind of change gears a little bit in the field and focus more on developing new data sets that reward models for understanding motion. And then we can build models that improve on those benchmarks. Does that answer your question?
Yep, that's a interesting points, and I agree that it's not necessarily a problem definition challenge as much as a data set focus challenge. So, yeah.
Okay, great. Stop you so that they can cross. Right. And one last application, which I've alluded to before, is household robotics. Right? If we want to build a robot that helps us out with our day-to-day tasks in our homes, that robot needs to understand what we're doing and what we want, and action recognition is a central part of that. So action recognition from video is very challenging, and it's challenging for lots of the same reasons that all computer vision problems are challenging. So computer vision is hard because the same thing can look very different depending on external factors like the lighting or the viewpoint. Like this cup looks very different depending on which angle we view it at, but it's still the same cup. Now with video, the problem's even harder. We have a lot more ways that things can vary just because we have the arrow of time, and now things can not just change in terms of appearance, but they can also change in their appearance over time, right? So actions can vary, not just in how they look at any particular moment, but they can also be different in the duration or the manner in which they're performed. The camera and the objects in the scene can also move around, meaning that something might be seen from a different viewpoint at one time to another. We also have the issue that videos are often lower quality. They're often a lot blurrier, grainier, lower resolution than high quality still images, right? So there's a lot of challenges when working with video, and video action recognition is kind of a good test bed for learning all sorts of, or solving all sorts of these challenges when in the video domain. So given that video action recognition shares a lot of the challenges with many other computer vision problems, it's no surprise that over the past decade or so, most of the work in this task has fallen into the framework of machine learning and deep learning. So in this framework, there's essentially 2 steps. First, we collect a large amount of data that's related to the task that we want to solve. Usually it's, in our case, videos with labels assigned to them for the actions that occur in those videos. And then in the second step, we train a model to then label or perform the task that we collected the data for, right? So in this case, it's classifying actions in video. And the hope is that if we have a large data set and we have a good model, we'll be able to learn a model that's generalizable to new videos that we haven't seen in the past during training. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with machine learning, but the reason I kind of give this simplified picture is because it really illuminates the two main ways that we can improve video action recognition. So the first is data sets, right? Action recognition requires large data sets, and there's a lot of ways that these data sets can be improved and made bigger. And so I'm going to present some contributions in that space. And then there's also a lot of room for improvement in terms of models. It's good deep models for video it's a very much open problem, and we provide a lot of contributions in this space as well. So to start, I'm going to talk about our contributions in terms of data sets. So let's revisit this picture of machine learning, right? If we have a lot of data, this should work well, right? Models tend to work, deep models in particular tend to work really well if they're fed lots and lots of data during training. But often we don't have enough data to train a deep model for the particular task that we want. Maybe it's a very niche task that not a whole lot of data exists. So what we typically do in this case is transfer learning, right? We pre-train a model on some source task where we have lots and lots of data available. And then we fine tune that same model on the target task where we have maybe less data. So here, maybe we do generic action recognition as our source data set, but some more niche gesture recognition in our target data set on the right. And so when I say that I'm going to be focusing on how to improve data sets for video action recognition, I'm specifically going to focus on this source data set part on the left. So there's been a lot of work in developing good pre-training data sets that are generalizable to lots of downstream tasks. But as I'll show, there's still a lot of room for improvement, and this is where we're going to be making our contribution. So let's look at the data sets that are typically used for this pre-training of video models. So usually they involve mutually exclusive actions from a wide range of action categories. So the actions could be anything from sitting and standing to playing basketball, but they're usually just short clips, just a couple of seconds. And the goal is just to solve this classification task on this this random collection of actions. And what experience has shown is that if we have lots and lots of pre-training data of this form, we can get really good performance on all sorts of downstream tasks. So it's not just good for this particular set of actions, but it's good for this particular set of actions, but it's good for all sorts of action recognition tasks from video. Since we've seen that data is just so important for this task, there's been a lot of work over the past decade in really making these data sets bigger and bigger and bigger. So just to give you a sense of scale, in around 2011, the state-of-the-art data set was less than 10,000 videos for action recognition. But now in 2019, 2020, we've got well over 500,000 videos in the largest data set available for pre-training. So this is like a factor of 100 just about increase over the past 10 years. And so I just want to quickly kind of verify here that this data is actually doing something for us, right? So, we've over the years, the tasks and the models have changed a lot. It's kind of hard to tell whether that progress is due to increases in data or increases in models. Improvements in models. And so what we do here is we run a quick experiment to see just how much effect that data has on downstream performance. So here we take subsets, gradually larger subsets of the kinetics data set, starting down with 5 video clips per action, going all the way up to the full data set with around 700 videos per action. And we see that the downstream accuracy on the validation set improves pretty quickly. The more we increase the size of the training data set, the higher the accuracy goes. So it's no real surprise. This is exactly what we expected, right? More data means better, more accurate models. But there is one observation that I want to make here, which is that we haven't quite plateaued, right? There's a lot of room for improvement, actually. And there's also, it's not really clear that, you know, we've hit a spot where more data isn't going to help, right? So what we'd like to do in this part of the talk is explain how we can explore off to the right side of this graph. So one obvious thing to do would just be to collect more data, right? But the problem is that the data sets we have are already so expensive that if we tried to increase them or increase the amount of data by a factor of 10 or a factor of 100, it would be completely infeasible. So the full kinetics data set with 650,000 videos, it took over 10,000 human hours to annotate. That's a lot already, but right, if we think about exploring, you know, a couple notches over to the right in this graph, right, if we want to multiply this, you know, by another factor of 100, we're looking at 1 million hours of human annotation to create this data set. And I think that's infeasible and probably not a good thing to spend 1 million hours annotating a data set. So we're going to try and do something a little smarter. So to see how that might be possible, let's look at how this data is actually collected now. So the video annotation process for a data set like kinetics looks a little bit like this. First, we list the action that we're looking for, and then we search for those actions on YouTube, right? I mean, it could be any web video sharing site, but kinetics specifically comes from YouTube videos. And then we trim these videos to short clips, and then we have annotators verify or reject clips based on whether they see the particular action of interest appearing in that clip. Sorry, having some technical difficulties again. Just give me one moment here to figure this out. To accept or reject it. And if we want to do better than this, I'd say let's just look at these first 2 steps, right? Just this step where we get a list of actions and we search on YouTube for those actions. So what's interesting is that if we search YouTube for an action, depending on the action, we're probably going to get a lot of really solid, relevant results without any need for human verification, right? And so what I'd say is that if we just eliminate step 3 and 4 and just keep step 1 and 2, we can probably get a pretty good approximation of a labeled data set without any need for human verification of each video. And to see why this can work, just think about how YouTube search might work, okay? If I search for rock climbing, all the videos that come up are videos that mention rock climbing somewhere in the title or somewhere in the description, right? So essentially what's going on is that these actions are already getting annotated. The people who upload the videos are already labeling this as a rock climbing video, and we don't need any outside annotators to verify that for us. And so we're not the first people to notice this. There's a whole field of research called Webley supervised learning that tries to take advantage of this fact, right? The fact that the metadata that exists out on the internet already contains most of the labels that we need, right? But there's a lot of advantages here that I think are underexplored in the space of video action recognition, right? So big advantages are that no human annotation is needed when we collect a new data set. That data is already annotated. It's also easy to add more data, right? YouTube is getting bigger every day. If a new sport gets invented, it's going to be easy for us to collect data relevant to that sport. But the main disadvantage is that these labels are going to be often noisy, right? Not every single video, if I search for rock climbing, is going to be directly relevant to rock climbing. So for example, we might have a video of someone going over their rock climbing gear or interviewing a famous rock climber. And that means that it might be tough for us to collect data that's always going to be relevant to the task or relevant to the action that we're searching for. So previous work in Webley supervised learning kind of just ignores this issue. And it actually works out pretty well, right? If we just search for rock climbing and we assume that every video that comes back is going to be relevant to rock climbing, that's actually pretty, it's a pretty good approach, right? Most of the videos we get are going to be relevant, and it's going to be enough to learn good video representations. But what we notice is that we can actually do a little bit better, right? If we just think of a video as rock climbing, we're missing out on all the fine-grained information, all the nuance that comes from the title, the channel name, the description, all of the information that we can scrape off of YouTube relevant to that video, right? So in this case, here's a video that shows up when you search for rock climbing, where it's someone showing off their rock climbing gear, right? And if we just assumed that this was a video of rock climbing, we'd be wrong. But instead, if we actually look at the text, we can see that this isn't quite a video about rock climbing, it's a video about rock climbing gear. And so maybe if we're able to consider the rich information that we have about each video, we can do better than simply assuming that each video is going to be exactly what we searched for, right? So that's essentially what we propose in this work. Specifically, our contributions are these. First, we collect an extremely large scale Webley supervised video representation learning dataset from YouTube. This dataset we call Web Video Text 70 million because it has 70 million clips, and that's over 22 years of video, which is, I think it's the largest dataset in terms of the number of unique clips that it contains. Also, we introduce an approach that uses rich supervision from scraped text metadata to learn better Webley supervised video representation. So specifically, we use some of the text data that I discussed on the past slide, right? We use the titles, the descriptions, the tags, and then the name of the channel or the uploader of a particular video. Finally, we show that this leads to improved accuracy on several downstream tasks. So first, let's talk about the data set, right? We start by collecting action categories of interest. In our case, we just use the 700 action categories from Kinetics. Then we search YouTube for those actions, and we collect 100,000 videos from each set of search results, right? This is how we get the 70 million videos and 22 years of video. So the cool thing is that this works for any action categories. There's no human intervention in the loop, so we can always repeat it. We can always replenish the data set if we need more videos. And so when we collect this data set, we get a lot of videos and we get a lot of text metadata. And I think it's important to kind of verify our assumptions and make sure this text metadata looks like kind of how we expect. So one thing that we find is that the text metadata seems to always refer to the search term that we searched for. And somewhere, even if it's not immediately in the title of the video, somewhere in the tags, somewhere in the description, somewhere in the channel name, it's going to say barbecue, right? And the great thing is that these are often really detailed descriptions of the video. So right here, we don't just know that this is barbecue. We know that this guy's making chicken tenders. We know that he's trying to do this quickly. It's a quick meal. We know that he's doing it in his backyard. We know what type of grill he's doing this on. This is a lot of really great detailed information that we would lose out on if we just thought of this as a barbecue video, right? And these descriptions are all written by humans, right? It's actually pretty rare that we get rich, detailed human written captions at such a large scale. So now there are some issues of noise with this data set, but that was expected, and it's important to understand kind of where this noise comes from. So some common examples are that you might have redundant information. The title and the description might be exactly the same, like in the first example on the right. We also sometimes have signals that are empty, but again, that's fine because we'll get information from the other signals in those cases. We also have data that's kind of maybe auto-generated, like uploaded from my iPhone. We also have descriptions like, don't forget to like and subscribe to my channel, right? This is sort of irrelevant to what's going on in the video, but it's very common on a sharing site like YouTube. Occasionally we get deceptive or clickbaity titles, but it's really hard to kind of estimate how common that is. Doesn't seem to be too big of a problem. So one thing though that is actually quite challenging and also pretty interesting about this data set is that as we grow the size of the data set, the quality of the data we collect actually seems to change, right? So this is something that we don't usually have to worry about in supervised learning, right? If I label 10 examples, if I label 100 or 1,000 examples, we're going to assume that those are all labeled with the same process and therefore of the same quality. But if we collect data from YouTube, we're essentially going to have to, as we grow the data set, go deeper and deeper into the search results. And as we go deeper and deeper into the search results, we're going to get examples that are less and less relevant to the thing we searched for, right? And so what that looks like in our data set is actually the deeper we go into the search results, the shorter the descriptions get that we collect. Right, the descriptions and the tags associated with each video actually drop in word length pretty significantly as we grow the data set by a factor of 10, 100,000, right? So kind of the thing I learned here is that it's actually non-trivial and very challenging to scale these Webley supervised data sets. So we kind of go into this, or many Webley supervised learning approaches kind of go into this assuming that web data is infinite and it's always going to be equally noisy, and this is just simply not the case. So it's something we have to consider as we move forward. So now I'll talk about our approach and specifically how we use this data and the metadata signals that we collect. So we take a contrastive learning approach where the goal is to learn a video representation, and we do this by aligning the video representation with the correct metadata representation for that video. So we have some metadata signal like the title of a video, and we also have the metadata signal, the title of many other videos. And so the goal here is let's make sure that the video embedding is close to the correct text embedding and not very close to the incorrect text embeddings. And this is accomplished using a ranking loss. So we actually use a fixed text encoder and we focus entirely on training the video embedding. This is, I guess, just an important implementation detail to consider. And during training, like I said, we use a ranking loss. The ranking loss is very standard. It's basically just if the distance between the positive pair, the correct video and metadata is large, then you get a penalty. And if it's small, that means they're close together, you don't get a penalty. Okay. Now, if we want to use multiple metadata signals, we can do a multitask pre-training approach where we just add multiple ranking losses, one for each of the different metadata signals that's available, right? And these all look exactly the same. They're just aligning the video embeddings with the different metadata signals that are available. So scaling is a huge issue here. So I want to just make a comment on kind of the cost of pre-training. So this model on 70 million videos, we can train it in less than 4 days if we use 64 TPUs. That gives us a batch size of about of 1,024, which allows us to train much faster than we normally would on on a single core. And pre-train this model on our 70 million videos, and then we fine-tune it on several target data sets, including kinetics, HMDB 51, and UCF 101. So now I'll get into our findings from our experiments. So for this first set of experiments, what we do is we compare the utility of each of these different metadata signals to each other. So recall there's 4 different types of metadata that we use. And so if we just take each one at a time, we find that all of them do better than just a model that's trained completely from scratch. So it's always good to use these data. Some are much more useful than others, and titles seem to be the one that work the best individually. But if we do the multitask approach and we use all of the metadata signals, we get a further boost in downstream performance. So the best thing that we can do is to use all of the signals. But what's important here is that for these experiments, we're using a pretty small subset of the full 70 million videos. So here we're just using 500,000, something that's comparable with the size of kinetics. And the reason that's important is that as we scale this up to 70 million videos, we actually see that the multitask and the single task training actually kind of flip in terms of which one's better than the other. So at smaller data set sizes, it's better to use all tasks during pre-training, but as we make this data set larger and larger, the titles only approach, the single task using just the titles, greatly outperforms using all of the signals. So now the reason I think this is the case is just that the descriptions and the tags seem to really not scale as well as the titles, right? We saw that the descriptions and the tags tend to get much shorter the larger the video datasets get. So it's probably the case that the titles are just the most robust out of all of the metadata signals that we have. And so, it's as we make this data set larger and larger, we go deeper and deeper into the search results. It's better to just use the best signal rather than use all of the signals if some of those other signals are just too noisy to get anything from. So if we take that titles only approach and we scale it all the way up to 70 million videos, what we find is actually really nice result. What we find is that the performance of the Wedley supervised model achieves the exact same downstream performance as a model that's pre-trained using strongly labeled data, so using the kinetics data set. So it's actually kind of the implication here is that if we hadn't spent those 10,000 hours of human time annotating kinetics, we could have done just as well on this task by just simply gathering as many videos as we could and ignoring the whole verification and human annotation step. So I think this is a pretty great result. It shows that Webley supervised learning and strongly supervised learning, can be equally useful. So here's where our work stands in comparison with some similar recent work. So there's been some other kind of work in the realm of Webley and unsupervised, self-supervised learning that kind of bears similarity to our work. One is audio-video synchronization, right? So in this, we have a video and we try and synchronize different video clips with the audio at that point in time. So we want to make sure that the video embedding for a point in time and the audio embedding for a point in time line up. This is pretty similar to what we're doing, except they're using audio, we're using a text description, right? Another approach is using the narration of a video and trying to align that in time to a particular point in the video. So these two approaches, they're both been recently introduced and have used large amounts of kind of unlabeled data to pre-train. And what we find is that our approach outperforms them both on HMDB and is comparable with the best approach on UCF 101. So in some senses, we're doing better than this prior work. So this next result, for this one, what we do is we show that we can combine Webley supervised learning and fully supervised or strongly supervised learning, such as kinetics. So recall that what I showed before is that the downstream performance for our Webley supervised approach and kinetics, the strongly supervised approach, get the exact same downstream accuracy on HMDB 51. That's the top section of this chart. Now, if we instead do a two-step pre-training procedure where we start by training on our Webley supervised task, and then we fine-tune on kinetics, and then we fine-tune on the target task, we find that we do even better, right? So having a good initialization from our model leads to better results on kinetics, which leads to better results on the final downstream task. So this is really nice. It shows that our approach and the kinetics approach are not in conflict. In fact, they're complementary. They're not just giving you the same information in different ways. They're allowing you to get even better performance by combining them. So the final result I want to share is that we took this approach and we applied it to an ensemble of several video action recognition models, and we submitted this to the CVPR 2020 Kinetics Challenge, and we won first place. So this approach has achieved a new state-of-the-art on the kinetics dataset. I have to thank my co-authors, specifically who really led the charge on this submission. I was not responsible for the ensemble approach to this that we submitted to this challenge, but my contribution was in terms of collecting and pre-training the models on the 70 million videos collected off YouTube. Great, so that wraps up this part of the talk. So some things to take away here. Text metadata that we collect from YouTube is a very rich source of supervision. And the nice thing is that it's essentially free. We can collect it without having any human in the loop. However, Webley supervised methods are not trivially scalable. We actually have to think carefully about which signals we want to use if we want to get the best performance. And finally, we can take Webley supervised and strongly supervised approaches and combine them to get something that's better than either individually. So we've shown that we can push the boundary and not just match it. And now, one second here, just having an issue with the audio again. However, Webley supervised methods are not trivially scalable. We actually have to think carefully about which signals we want to use if we want to get the best performance. And finally, we can take Webley supervised and strongly supervised approaches and combine them to get something that's better than either individually. So we've shown that we can push the boundary and not just match it. And now I'm going to move on to some of my other projects, which deal with how to improve models for video action recognition. So first, let's talk about how we can improve motion understanding in models. So at the risk of simplifying or oversimplifying decades of research on action recognition, let me just say that broadly, there's two ways we can look at a video. One is that we can think of a video as just a collection of frames with no order or sequence among these frames. Right, this is this approach on the left, and essentially what we do here is we put each frame through a a model, maybe a convolutional neural network, which extracts some features from that frame, and then we take those frame level features and we aggregate them in some way. Right, so if we treat this video purely as a bag of frames, maybe this aggregation function is just a naive averaging or something like that. But if we want to consider long-term context, we can do that with this approach too. We can consider the sequence of frame level features using an LSTM or some other recurrent model, for example. The other approach is to treat the video as a video from the bottom up, right? So in this case, we're not just extracting a feature vector for each frame, we're actually extracting a feature vector for the entire clip. But generally, the advantage here is that we can look at pixel level differences between pairs or groups of adjacent frames. And in most recent work in the kind of deep learning era of video action recognition, the main difference between these two approaches is that the frame-by-frame models use 2D convolutions and the clip-level models use 3D convolutions. So the 2D convolutions just look at patches of an image and are able to get some appearance features using these filters. But a 3D convolution expands the filters across the time dimension to get a patch that covers groups of adjacent frames. And so it's able to get features that don't just recognize patterns of appearance, but also recognize patterns that involve a change in appearance over short periods of time. So 3D convolutions, right? The idea is they can detect changes in appearance, but what experience has shown is that these are often insufficient to model motion in video. Okay, so I got a question from Ryan, which is how do recurrent layers fit into your stratification of motion modeling? So I'd still kind of lump these into the frame-by-frame approach. I think we have to make a distinction between modeling short-term context, kind of at the pixel level or at the level of instantaneous motion, and modeling long-term context at the level of frame-level features. So I think recurrent layers do a really good job modeling kind of broad semantic changes in the features over time, but they don't do a good job at modeling kind of pixel level instantaneous motion. So I'd still kind of lump them into the frame-by-frame approaches, but there is kind of a midway point between these two, right? Where I'd probably more likely classify them. Yeah. Doesn't have any way of identifying correspondences between pairs of frames over time, right? We can't tell. We can only tell that this pixel is changing from one frame to another. We can't tell that this thing started over here and it moved over here, but these are the same thing, right? So there's been some work in trying to augment 3D CNNs to have this capability, and it's shown a lot of promise. And I think that tells you a lot about what 3D convolutions are, what their limitations might be. Another good reason for why 3D CNNs might not be the best at modeling motion is that when we pre-train models on some of these video action recognition tasks, often they don't reward the models for learning patterns related to motion. So if we train a model on an action recognition data set where the actions can all be identified by a particular object or a particular scene, we don't actually need any motion understanding in order to solve that task. And so in that case, 3D convolutions maybe are capable of learning motion, but they're not really learning it given the information that they're given during training. So this in this project, which I'm actually only going to touch on very, very briefly, the whole point was to learn generalizable motion features from video, specifically. Okay, so I got another question from Jason, which is that the 3D convolutions indeed do not track points, but they approximate motion boundaries, which demonstrated high performance pre-deep learning, don't they? And yeah, that's true. And I think that gets us a lot of the way towards really understanding motion in video. But I think still we have to look at the data sets that we're training on and find out whether the 3D CNNs that we're training are really, really are learning some of these motion relationships. So that was kind of the focus of this work, was not necessarily asking like what are 3D CNNs capable of, but more asking what types of patterns do 3D CNNs learn if they're trained on the action recognition data sets that we have today. But what we found is that it doesn't really they don't really reliably learn these motion features just given the tasks that we train them on. But if we give them some auxiliary tasks that are related to motion, they can do a little bit better. But one, I think, way to think of one reason why we might suspect that 3D CNNs are lacking some really important motion characteristics is if you just look at the models that have been successful in the past for optical flow estimation. So a task that is directly related to understanding motion. The models for this task only work if you have some sort of correlation layer between that looks at displacements between pairs of adjacent frames. And there's actually been a lot of work recently in trying to augment 3D CNNs to kind of add that capability. And that can also show increased performance on a lot of downstream tasks. So I think that suggests that there are some limitations in the capabilities of 3D CNNs, just based on this evidence from the literature. Yeah, hopefully that answers your question. Been during training. So this in this project, which I'm actually only going to touch on very, very briefly, the whole point was to learn generalizable motion features from video, specifically using the framework of 3D convolutions. And so what we found to work is a simple distillation approach, where we take a model that has some motion features already baked into it, and we train a 3D CNN to copy that model, right? So the 3D CNN, by learning to copy that model, it's now rewarded for learning features that are relevant and useful for motion recognition, right? And what this ends up giving us is a 3D CNN that is more generalizable and does do better on downstream tasks. But that's all I'm going to say about this work. If you want to know more, please refer to my dissertation. So we also provide some contributions in the area of understanding long-term context in video. So to see why this is important, just consider that actions don't happen in isolation, right? They happen as a broader, longer sequence of actions that you perform, throughout a scene or throughout your day, right? And, here's a quick example. If I open the refrigerator, what's going to come next? I'm probably going to close the refrigerator, right? Maybe I'll go through, I'll grab something, but shortly after opening the refrigerator, I'm going to close it. I'm not just going to leave it open and walk away, at least not usually. So how do we incorporate this understanding of the sequence of actions that have already happened in the past to inform what we think is going to happen in the future, right? This is kind of the question we ask in this work. And again, I'm just going to touch on this very briefly so that I can get to the last section of this talk. But what we propose here is to use a variant on hourglass networks that act in the temporal domain. So we take frame level features and we use a kind of an encoder-decoder framework to get frame level features that have not just an understanding of local context, but also of global context. This is accomplished through these skip connections, which pass information from the local part of the model to the global part of the model. Okay, so now I'm going to dive into the last section of the talk, which is on compositionality in action recognition. So compositionality is important because it allows us to identify actions which we haven't seen in the past. okay? So to see why that's important, just consider that Kinetic 700 contains only 700 action classes, right? And in the real world, there aren't just 700 action classes that we can do. There's actually an unlimited number of possible actions that might appear in our day-to-day life. We can see combinations or sequences of actions that we've never seen before. We can see actions performed in a new manner or in a new situation or context than we've ever seen before. And if we want to be able to recognize these new actions on the fly, it's not sufficient to just perform, a mutually exclusive K-way action classification, right? We actually need to be able to identify novel actions at test time. And so there's a nice task, which is a good test bed for building models that do this. And this is temporal visual grounding. So this is the task that we're going to be considering in this part of the talk. And in this task, you're given two things. You're given a video and you're given a natural language query. And the goal is to find the point in time that matches the action described in the query, right? So here we have a video of a little girl playing, and it says the little girl jumps back up after falling. We're going to assume exactly one point in time that corresponds to that text query. And so our goal is to find out when that happened in the video. So let's take a look at how prior approaches have looked at this problem. So what a lot of these prior approaches have done is they take the text query and they encode it using some text feature embedding. And then they compare that text feature embedding with frame level embeddings collected from the video. And so if we are able to align the frames and the text embeddings together, then what we should be able to do is just compare the text embedding and the video embedding at each frame, and then whichever frames are well aligned, that tells us that the action described in this query is happening at this particular frame. So there's been some prior work that approaches this roughly within this framework. But I think there's some limitations doing this this way. And specifically, I think it has to do with how we encode the entire text query in just one feature representation. So consider these observations. First, queries are compositional, right? They don't just contain one action. They can potentially contain many actions that have to happen in a sequence, right? And this is an artifact mostly of the particular task that we're trying to solve here, right? We're trying to identify a very particular, unique moment in time in a video. And in order to do that, we have to refer not just to the action that's happening, but maybe we have to refer to context or different actions that are happening around that action in order to be specific enough to identify a particular exact action. And in this case, also temporal ordering is very important. If we have multiple sub-actions that need to be detected, we also need to know what order or what temporal relationship those actions need to have relative to each other. And so if we look at the query as just one unit, right, we just embed it into one feature representation, then the problem is we have to then find an alignment between that whole sentence and the video. But the problem is that sentence encodes not just one thing, but encodes many things. It encodes context and it encodes temporal relationships. So what we propose to do instead is split the sentence up into unique and discrete sub-events, and then align those sub-events to the video separately, right? That's these, the red and the blue circles here are those comparisons being made. And then what we need to do is we need to enforce temporal consistency. So we need to find some way to ensure that when we align these sub-events together or align them to the video, we need to make sure that the detections that we find are actually consistent with what the sentence or the temporal relationship the sentence says they must have with each other. So our approach at a glance is two contributions compared to prior work. First, we decompose the query into sub-events, and in fact, a flexible number of queries that is determined at inference time. And once we align those detected sub-events to the video, we then enforce temporal consistency between them, which allows us to filter out spurious detections and ensure that the final detection is consistent with what the whole sentence says. So let's start by showing how we decompose the sentence into sub-events. So we actually propose two approaches for doing this. The first uses the Stanford parser to get a parse tree for the sentence. And once we have that parse tree, we then take any clauses that we detect in the sentence to be a unique sub-event. So in this example, the clauses are the S and S bar tokens. And so what we do is we look at, for each of these clauses, whichever words belong to that clause directly and don't have any other clauses kind of in between them and that particular token, they get assigned to that clause. So the blue and the red are the two sub-events that are detected, but we actually throw away this third one that's detected because it's only got a single words. So the other approach that we introduce is to use a learned attention mechanism to detect these locations of these sub-events. So we use an LSTM, specifically a bidirectional LSTM, to produce these attention masks, and it's all learned end-to-end. So rather than using a fixed parser and a fixed heuristic to identify discrete sub-events, we actually use this attention mask to learn to detect these on the fly, and so the LSTM can be updated end-to-end. But crucially, I just want to point out that the number of sub-events, we don't assume that this is known at inference time, right? It can actually be variable. We don't have a fixed number of sub-events that we detect every time. So once we've segmented the sentence into multiple sub-events, then we have to come up with a representation for each of these sub-events. So the way we do this is it's a little complex, but we'll go through this step by step. So first, what we do is we apply glove and LSTM to the word embeddings, or sorry, to get word level embeddings for each token in the sentence. Then we pool those features using the sub-event decomposition that we showed in the previous slide. Finally, we extract features for each of the pooled sub-event features that we found using a simple multi-layer perceptron with multiple output layers. And these multiple output layers correspond to three components that make up the sub-event representation. First, we have a language embedding, or language features that are going to be aligned with the video embedding for matching. Next, we have the position embedding, which is intended to encode the temporal position of the particular sub-event in the sentence. Then we have the weight, which allows us to weight the importance of a particular sub-event. It allows us to, for example, discard a particular sub-event or have it have no effect on the final output if maybe it's a need to restart the audio one last time here, so sorry about that. Now would be a great time if anyone has any questions about stuff so far. Happy to answer those. We have the weight, which allows us to weight the importance of a particular sub-event. It allows us to, for example, discard a particular sub-event or have it have no effect on the final output if maybe it's a spurious or not useful detection. So then once we have those sub-event features, then we have to locate each sub-event in the video. And so what we do here is we actually just compare the sub-event features with the video features using the Euclidean distance. So that Euclidean distance, the reason we expect this to work is because the whole thing is trained end-to-end. So the language embeddings and the video features are aligned through the training process. Now for the video features, we don't train these end-to-end. We actually use pre-trained embeddings that are provided by previous work. This is essentially just a VGG net trained on ImageNet and applied frame by frame. So that's how we decompose a query into sub-events and locate those sub-events in the video. So now let's talk about what we do once we have those detections, and specifically how we enforce temporal consistency between them. So we do this through actually a pretty straightforward but effective mechanism, which is just, we call the temporal rounding network. So essentially what we do is we sum the matches. At each point in time, we sum the matches across all of the different sub-events that we detected. And then we refine that sum using a sum of signals from the refinement network, which here is written as phi. So the refinement network, what this is intended to do is it's intended to downweight or upweight a particular matching if it's inconsistent or consistent with the position embedding from that particular sub-event. And it's implemented just as a two-layer, multi-layer perceptron, which is trained end-to-end. So for evaluation and for experimentation of our model, I just want to go through some of the data sets that we use really quickly. All of these data sets are kind of built on top of the same set of videos. They use 10,000 unedited video clips from Flickr that are 30 seconds each and segmented into 5-second clips. The first data set is called the demo, and it includes 40,000 natural language queries, which are located at different points in time in these 10,000 videos. Now, the next two data sets are quite interesting. Tempo TL and Tempo HL are designed specifically to test models in their compositional reasoning ability. So Tempo TL, the way this is accomplished is that they actually construct artificial queries made out of pairs of demo queries. So this is called Tempo template language because the queries all have a form or all take the form X before Y or Y after X or X then Y. They come from one of these templates. Finally, we have Tempo human language, which is similar to Tempo temporal language, but the difference is that the queries have been rewritten in natural language. So that way, it's not just an artificial sentence, it's a real sentence written by a human that is guaranteed to make sense. So first, let's show some results on Tempo TL. So when we train a model on Tempo TL, it's only seeing artificial sentences that are made up of combinations of demo sentences. And then when we evaluate, we split that evaluation up in terms of the different temporal words that were included in each query, right? So they come from these templates, X before Y, X after Y, X then Y, and we can split the evaluation up within these different temporal words. So that's what you're seeing here. And we compare with prior work that I've mentioned before, right? The ones that consider each query to just be one singular event. Those are called MCN and TAL. But we also compare with work that specifically considers compositionality, which is MLLC. And so this work's interesting. It considers, or it assumes in advance that each query is going to have exactly 2 sub-events. So that has a big advantage when there are 2 sub-events, but it actually doesn't perform so well more generally because often we have queries with fewer or more sub-events than just 2. So our models, by comparison, allow for a flexible number of sub-events. We say K sub-events, but I want to specify that K is not fixed. It's chosen per example. And so what we find is that on these artificial sentences, our model does the best, and specifically our model that uses the parser as its decomposition method works the best. So that tells me that this the parser works really well on these kind of rigid artificial sentences. But now, changing gears to Tempo HL. Tempo HL uses natural sentences. And what we find here is that our model still performs the best, but our model with the learned attention mechanism is the one that works the best. So it's actually better, more generally, to use a learned decomposition method rather than using the fixed method that comes from the Stanford parser. So, and then one other experiment here. One thing that we want to guarantee is that our model doesn't just work on complex queries. We want it to work on simple queries where there's just one sub-event, and also, extremely complex queries where there are, 4 or more sub-events. So we break down the evaluation on Tempo HL in terms of the number of clauses that are detected in each sentence. So more clauses, we generally assume, means the sentence is more complex. And what we find is that our model does better than the prior approaches at all levels of complexity. So now I present an ablation study that shows that the different components we introduce all have some positive contribution on the final output of the model. So, the final performance of the model. So this top component, top section of the graph, we explore 2 components. First of all is the sub-event decomposition, and the second is the refinement network. So both of these are quite important to include in the model, but what's more important than the refinement network is the sub-event decomposition. So it's more important that, I should specify, we get kind of more of a drop in performance if we don't do sub-event decomposition than if we don't do refinement. The next part of the ablation concerns the sub-event representation. So like I said, there are 3 embeddings or 3 outputs that we use to represent each sub-event. And so we can remove some of these. One is the position embedding, which encodes the relative positions of these sub-events to one another. And if we remove that, we get some drop in performance. The other component is if we drop the scalar weight, which allows us to kind of treat different sub-events with different weight in the final matching computation. Removing that also hurts performance. So the best thing to do is to use all of these components. So finally, the takeaways here are that natural language queries have compositional structure, and they also have temporal structure. And we need to leverage both of these if we want to get the best performance on this temporal grounding task. And specifically, this gets us better generalization, not just to complex queries with lots of sub-events, lots of compositional structure. It also gets us better generalization with simple events with not so much compositional structure. Okay, so before I thank all the people who've helped me with this work, I want to mention really quickly just some other accomplishments during my time at U of M that I'm particularly proud of and I think are pretty important. The first of these is the Michigan Data Science Team. So this is a student org that I founded when I was a first-year grad student with a faculty member in CSE named Jake Abernathy. The goal of this organization was to teach data science skills, kind of among students to each other and for each other, teaching each other, and doing this through specifically solving interesting data science problems. So we wanted to learn practical skills, and we wanted to learn it in a collaborative way. And this turned out to be a really, really popular idea, and our group grew to well over 100 members at different points in the past 5 years. And so it's been a huge responsibility, but also a lot of fun leading this group. I was a student leader on this group for over 4 years, and during those 4 years, we've accomplished so much. We've collaborated with some really cool people, such as the city of Flint. We helped them with recovery from the Flint water crisis by detecting potential undetected lead pipes in their infrastructure. And that work was actually published in KDD and won a Best Paper Award. We've also published in NeurIPS. We've also published in workshops and symposiums related to data science for good all over the country. So, I'm really proud of what this group has done, and I've got to say I've learned so much, not just about data science, but about running a huge team and organizing a large group of people. And it's been a really rewarding and amazing experience for me. Another cool contribution is I organized the first ever Michigan Data Science Hackathon when I was, I think this was 2019. So this was an overnight hackathon with over 50 competitors, all working on cool data sets throughout the night, and they were judged by professors from around the university in the morning who gave them feedback on the statistical rigor and the novelty and the impact of their results. So, both of these things that I've helped organize, I think they've had a huge impact on the university. They've helped so many students learn data science skills, and very proud to have been a part of organizing them. And now I'd like to thank my co-authors who've all contributed so much to this work throughout the years. Everyone on this slide has co-authored some aspect of this work, and I'm hugely grateful to these people for all of their contributions. They've all made a big impact, and they've all just been great influences on me, and yeah, really grateful to them for all of their contributions. Next, I'd like to thank my lab mates from the Vision and Learning Lab. These people are all just so incredibly knowledgeable and hardworking, and even those who I haven't worked with directly on a project, I feel like I've learned so much just being around them and seeing how they do research. It's just been a great experience being part of such a big, such a productive lab, and I've learned a lot from all of these people. So thank you. Next, I'd like to thank my committee who have provided some really great feedback on this work, and Shirley will provide some really tough questions in just a minute here. I especially want to thank Ja and Radha, who have just been fantastic advisors and mentors, and they've advised me directly on a lot of the work that I've talked about today. And they've also just set a great example of how to do research, and taught me some of the kind of big picture approaches to solving problems that I use every day. I especially want to thank Ja. For those of you who haven't worked with Ja, I feel really lucky to have been advised by him for the past 5 years. He's always got great ideas. He's always thinking about the next steps and always thinking about the big picture. He's just really an incredible researcher and a fantastic role model. So thank you, Ja, for all of your mentorship throughout the years. Finally, I want to thank my family and my friends and my girlfriend. These people are just so important. I mean, I don't think I would have made it very far in grad school without the support of all of these people. So, they don't just keep me entertained, they keep my spirits up, they keep me motivated. These are the people that make me want to work hard every single day and be the best that I can be. So thank you to all these people for all of their support throughout the years. Okay, so that's the end of my talk. Thank you all so much for being here. I'm happy to take questions now. Please just post them in the chat or use the raise your hand feature, whatever you prefer. Thanks. Thank you. All right, so any questions from the committee?
Well, I can start asking a question. it's question plus clarification for the Webley supervision in the work where you created a large data set. You made an observation, which I think it's very interesting, on how the quality of data degrades as the data set grows. And yes, I was curious to hear more about that, as to why you think it's that, and also how it connects to the fact that this kind of data grows over time. Like as we speak now, I'm sure there are more videos that have been added, so there is a continuous source of data. So what's the relation between this kind of degradation that you observed and the fact that it's a continuous stream?
Yeah, so I think this degradation comes from the fact that we're going to start off by finding videos that are highly related to the search term and maybe have more mentions of the search term. But the farther deeper into the search results we go, the more strained we're going to be to find videos with lots of mentions of the search terms we're looking for. Now, I can't say how YouTube search works under the hood. I mean, I'm sure it's a very complicated thing, but I think it's orthogonal to the issue of dataset growth. So I think, you know, as YouTube grows. So I think as YouTube grows, I don't think the quality of videos is maybe significantly changing over time, or at least that's not what this is showing. This is just an issue of the bigger we try and grow our data set at a specific point in time, we're going to be more and more strained to find good videos. Yeah. Does that cover what you're asking?
Yeah, I guess a solution to that would be to just wait, and then you could still grow it, right? Because there will be more videos to draw from, which obviously will take more time.
Yeah, that's true. So we could just wait, and we could continually sample, you know, the top 1,000 videos every day on YouTube, and maybe that would be a pretty good way of growing the data set over time. And I imagine these scaling issues will probably get alleviated over time as YouTube continues to grow. But the scale at which we're trying to collect data here, I think we're collecting data essentially faster than people can add it, right? If we're looking at 100,000 videos related to rock climbing. So my main point here is just that often in supervised learning, we think, you know, all data is equal, right? But in Webley supervised learning, we really have to consider the value that each data point is going to add and how that can diminish if we're trying to collect data from, you know, not so great sources. Yeah.
Right. Okay. I can let others ask questions. I have some more.
Well, I guess, so just following up on that discussion point, sure, not all videos are created equal, but is a source like YouTube an unbiased source of that broad set of possible videos? Right, like the types of videos that are uploaded to YouTube are generally probably one of a few different types of sets of videos, but that may bias what you learn or add to the data set in a way that will lead to models that still perform fine, but maybe differently than humans might or robotics might or so on. How are you modeling that or addressing bias in that data?
Yeah, so I think the good news is that models pre-trained even on this biased data can generalize really well on all sorts of downstream tasks. So you can think of this as a good initializer, but not getting us all the way to a good model, right? So it takes good data on the target data side as well, and also it takes kind of a smart thinking about the models that we build and the assumptions that they encode, right? So, you know, just looking at a frame-by-frame model, that might work really well for YouTube. But if we then want to fine-tune that on a downstream task that needs more information about instantaneous motion, we might need to encode those assumptions into the model even during pre-training, even if it's not really all that relevant to the videos on YouTube, because you're right, the nature of videos on YouTube are very different from, you know, what we see in real life.
Yeah, and another aspect of that, I guess, as I understood your presentation, there's no consideration for grounding on the Webley supervised work, but you spend a lot of time on grounding in your later in your later work, although I don't know chronologically, it may have been before, I'm not sure. But what kept you from trying to look into grounding aspects in the Webley work, and do you think that would actually add to the quality of the data set?
Yeah, so I think that would add a lot to the quality of the models that are learned, but maybe not to the data set. I think the grounding problem on the data set side would be very hard, right? We don't have any good way of finding correspondences, like actual verified correspondences between the descriptions and the video. But we could potentially have a model that tries to learn these correspondences. And I think that's, I think that is a really good area. It's just, I think of it as future work. There's nothing kind of fundamentally stopping us from getting there, but there's a ton of work that needs to be solved first in terms of how do we scale to these large data sets. Just at the video level, how do we find an alignment between this metadata and the videos? I think there were a lot of unknowns here. It wasn't really clear whether YouTube titles would be a good signal to begin with. So that was a question we wanted to answer first before we started making it more complicated by grounding words or actions to points in time in the video.
Yep, that makes sense. If you do plan to continue in that future direction, I don't know what your plans are, but I would recommend reaching out to Loué. I don't know if you knew Loué when he was at Michigan. So he has work on weakly supervised grounding for objects, not for action. So it's a little different than what you're doing, but I think it's nevertheless relevant for general video work.
Yeah, I agree. And also kind of what you're proposing is, I think there's some similarities to some of the related work that I mentioned here. So these don't just try and match narration and sound to a clip. They also try and match it to the proper point in time in the clip. And that turns out to be a pretty important step for the nature of the data that this prior work is experimenting on. But for us, it seems like we can still do pretty well without needing to do that. Probably because the nature of the titles and the descriptions are more kind of video level than they are, clip or frame level.
Yep, makes sense. Well, while we're at it, let me ask another question on the grounding. So on the last part of the paper with temporal grounding networks, did you run into situations where like the language parsing didn't like match up with what your vision models wanted to learn or were able to learn? Like in some sense, I think the way like other works in object grounding in video use some notion of soft attention. But it seems to me like your approach requires a little bit more like hard attention on the temporal frame. So did you find like a limitation in the ability for the language segments to match up with the temporal segments?
Yeah, so the two different approaches that we propose here, one of them does hard attention and one does soft attention. So it's pretty hard to verify actually whether the soft attention is working in a quantitative way. But I do have some, representative examples, not in this talk, but in the thesis that show some good examples of them working. But in general, you're right. There are a lot of kind of degenerate cases where, maybe it just attends to the whole sentence and it can't figure out what to do. We have to keep in mind that this is, still a very tough problem, very far from being solved, right? The accuracy that we're getting is still pretty low, even with the state-of-the-art models. So the attention masks that we're learning definitely aren't perfect, but they definitely are giving the soft attention masks that are learned are giving a measurable improvement in performance over the hard attention masks, indicating to me that they're doing something useful.
Okay, cool.
I had another question, which was actually related to the same part of the work in terms of creating word representations. There has been a recent push as of late for contextualized embeddings. And it's not necessarily demonstrated they are always better. So different types, different embeddings are better. So I'll be curious to hear your thoughts with respect to that. So if you were to do contextualized embeddings such as BERT or Elmo, would that make a difference? And it's also, of course, the question of whether there is enough context for those to be meaningful.
Yeah, so I think context is quite important, and the LSTM that we use here gives us a little bit of context, not at the word embedding layer, but at the level of at the next level of word level features. And there has been some more recent work that uses more state-of-the-art word representations here, like from BERT, for example, in some of the work that came after this. I mean, ultimately, I think it's a great idea, and probably if we were to redo this now, we would use the more state-of-the-art text embedding and see how it does. The reason why we do it the way we do in this paper is just for proper comparison with prior work, which has, at the time, universally used a GLOVE plus an LSTM. But I think there's a huge opportunity here to improve not just the way we are representing words in the sentence, because obviously that broad context is important, given the type of compositionality we want to understand, but also actually there's a huge area for improvement in terms of the video models that we use here. The video models actually are a bit outdated, and I think I'd like to see how much further we can get just by improving those two components, just with the recent kind of state-of-the-art improvements in text embedding and in video feature embedding.
Yeah, and I think that makes sense. I don't think it's necessarily guaranteed that using something like BERT will improve. Despite the recent trends, there has been also work that showed that in certain cases, you're just fine with the more traditional embeddings like GLOVE. So it's just something to consider. It might help. And I guess it also depends, like I said, of the amount of context that you can provide and how much specificity there is.
Yeah, and recent work, like I mentioned, has shown that the type of text embedding really does make a difference, but I think it's kind of hard to figure out why, right? It could just be because BERT has a lot more data for training, and the model architecture of BERT isn't really the thing that's helping us here. It's kind of hard to detangle those things.
Right.
I do think there's a significant amount of work in the last year or two on vision plus language pre-training for arbitrary tasks related to those. Like there's a paper like I think BL-BERT, at least a dozen papers I've seen in the last year on pre-training, which is I think related to this point. So people are certainly looking at it.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And it would be great to revisit this in the future, considering all that recent work. Any other questions? Oh, I haven't checked the chat. I don't see any questions in the chat either.
Well, I can ask you one more question if no one else is speaking up. Right, so you say video is either a collection of frames or video is a body of pixels together, like a clip or whatever you called it, a volume. Don't you think that those are really two poles on a continuum?
Yeah, absolutely. And so, I mean, this is definitely a simplification, but I just kind of want to illustrate the point that there's actually, in these two extremes, we have advantages and disadvantages. So actually in the frame-by-frame approach, it's a lot easier to model kind of high-level semantic sequences if we just look at the change in the feature representations frame by frame over time. So just think about taking this aggregation function and replacing it with something like a temporal hourglass that we introduce, right? But if we go to the clip level, kind of the problem here is that actually it's not scalable. If we want to take the clip level approach and do this kind of hierarchical aggregation of pixel level features all the way up to really long-term context, these models aren't scalable enough, I mean, computationally, to be able to use this kind of hierarchical aggregation to get really long-term context in the same way that the frame-by-frame approaches work. So actually, these frame-by-frame approaches tend to model like more sequences or long-term temporal context, where at these clip level models, it's usually impossible, just given the kind of the constraints of or kind of the computational complexity of it. But you're right. There's a whole room in between. Like we could take a frame-by-frame clip level hybrid where we took a kind of a sliding window approach of clip level features over time. It's very easy to find kind of middle ground between these two. Any questions from the audience? Feel free to just post them in the chat.
Hello? Hey, I'm Roy. I just have a
Hey,
high level. Hey, yeah, thank you for the great talk. So given the massive amount of works going on pre-training and self-supervised learning, so it's natural to think, so what's next? And also, like, there are also a lot of critical questions remain to be answered in the field. So I'm wondering, so given, I'm really interested in the first work you talk about on data on pre-training, basically, and large-scale data. So what do you think? The transferability. So does transferability matter here? So say, so far your approach is more heuristic, right? So you are using all the labels from kinetics, and it's possible that you would transfer well to downstream tasks that involve spots and all those activities. So what do you think? Like, how would you measure, like, what data to use such that you will lead to a better transferability to other domains? And also, like, how do you measure, like, so is there a correlation between the pre-training performance and also the downstream performance or not? And so those sort of questions. So I'm quite interested in the field too.
Yeah. So kind of a lot of questions there. I mean, so I think it's really important to consider when we do pre-training, what exactly that pre-training task is trying to accomplish. And so one of the kind of advantages of self-supervised learning is that we can kind of change the goalposts a little bit. We can change our kind of our pre-training objective to focus on what we think is going to be useful to downstream tasks. So I think this is still a pretty underexplored area, right? But something I'd be really excited about is models that digest tons and tons of unlabeled videos and try and learn motion representations and show that works better for tasks where motion is clearly important, like gesture recognition. I think you could think of this as like maybe one approach would be trying to predict optical flow from videos using a video encoder decoder structure, and that's something we explore a little bit in the D3D work, but not at a huge scale. Yeah, so I mean I agree. I think there's a lot of room for improvement, and in terms of the types of pre-training tasks that we use, and hopefully what the result will be is that we can take a bunch of complementary approaches. Like if we want to learn things about semantics, we can use an approach like our text metadata mining to learn kind of semantic concepts from video. And then if we also want to have a model that's good at learning motion, we can add in auxiliary losses that help it learn motion. This was also kind of a theme in the D3D work, but again, at a smaller scale. Yeah, I'm not sure if there's
I think that makes sense. Like, so we want to learn some like general motion feature, which will transfer well to a variety of downstream tasks. But I think it's kind of hard to measure like the transferability right away. Like, so because sometimes you probably achieve a high accuracy on the training data on the pre-training, but you might not necessarily get a really good transfer to the downstream tasks. I mean, like I think I totally agree, like what you just said. So we could probably add more elements to the training. So maybe more like an ensemble of different models, like with motion and some with focus more on the appearance feature. And but I'm also interested to see like what's next for the field, and given all the the massive amount of work going on, and yeah. Also, I think so. I have been doing some research, and I found that like generic representation is great, but sometimes because the data domain varies too much, so it's hard to transfer data you trained on sports video to say like cooking video or to other domains. So it might be great. Like I also been talking with Jason recently about like data curation, and he also his team has awesome tools on data curation. So I'm also like curious just like where would that go? Like so I mean I think I got the answer, and I really appreciate your answer. Yeah.
Yeah, actually, one thing I'd like to see moving forward in the field, and actually this kind of touches on Ian's question in the chat about what do you see as the most important directions moving forward. I'd actually kind of ironically like to see also some focus on small scale, but really kind of hyper-focused data sets, right? You can think of like maybe even just some toy data sets like that test a model's ability to do really simple motion understanding tasks. Because it's kind of weird, there's this broad assumption in the field that the models we have, if they have 3D filters, that they're necessarily going to be good, spatiotemporal modelers. But I don't think that the data we have really rigorously tests that assumption. And so it would be really cool to have kind of like a suite or like a test bed of different kind of motion tasks or something like that, where we can just figure out where exactly these models work and where do these models fail. And that requires a whole different sort of kind of data annotation and data collection approach. But there's been some kind of promising work recently that's related that uses synthetic data sets. I think it's Cleverer and Cater both use kind of synthetic scenes to test some kind of the harder tasks that video recognition models aren't usually asked to do. This actually leads me into what I think is really the big area that we should be working on moving forward is causal representations of actions. And this is something that is approached a lot in these synthetic data sets, trying to understand an action not just as an appearance, but as a kind of a cause and effect, right? Like an action is something that has an effect on the world. And if we want a really generalizable representation of an action, we should just represent it as what we want that action to do, right? And then maybe if you do that in a really good way, you could then transfer that to a robot who then now has knowledge. I watched someone do this task. Now I know what the action is that is required to do that task. I mean, this is thinking way ahead, but I think some of these synthetic data sets actually do a pretty good job of testing these abilities, and it's clear that there's a long way to go forward.
Yeah, I totally agree. Like there should be more like a probing studies to look into like this kind of ability. But yeah, thank you so much. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Jonathan, just a side note, there's some work that a few groups have done on, I think they call them minimal pairs. Sort of given two images, and there's sort of has changed. What is the cause of that change? It's like getting toward the cause and effect that you're talking about.
Yeah.
Indeed.
Yes. So you're right. This work does kind of exist out there. I think it kind of hasn't kind of made the mainstream, right? Most of the models that we're testing for video action recognition are, being evaluated on data that's valued mostly for its scale and less for, kind of the breadth of ability that it's testing. So I'd like to see some of the more recent state-of-the-art approaches in 3D CNNs be kind of rigorously evaluated on some of those types of tasks.
Very cool. I think given time, we should probably end the public portion of the thesis defense.
Okay. We'll leave and enter the other meeting. Is that the plan?
Yeah. So then the committee would enter the private portion of the meeting.
Okay.
All right. So thank you, Jonathan, and thank you, everyone. And